how should we refer to not Israel, those Jews who live elsewhere in the world? Those not living in Israel are still a majority of the total Jewish population, though by far the two largest Jewish communities are America and Israel. They together comprise over 80% of the world's Jews. But what should we call us, we who don't live in the land of Israel? Well, the old term for people living outside of Israel was galut, or golus in Yiddish. Galut meant exile. Exile means you were pushed out. You were forced to leave. You can't return, or it's very hard. It's a state of not being where you belong. That was galut. A more common term throughout Jewish history, and certainly looking back on Jewish history, has been the word diaspora. Diaspora is actually not a uniquely Jewish word. The word diaspora originally was coined to refer to Greeks living outside of Greece, all over the Mediterranean. It comes from two Greek words, dia, which is like to spread, like a diorama, a diagram, and spore, which means seeds. So a diaspora is a spreading of seeds that set root where they are and grow differently in different soil and sun, but have a common ancestry. And so maybe diaspora makes sense to refer to Jews, but a diaspora generally spreads out from a center and always points back toward that center. Is that really the way Jews living outside of Israel think today? Are they always pointed back toward the center, or sometimes are they pointed to the world around them? Do they only plant trees in Israel, or do they sometimes plant trees and roots where they live? A third option, what I tend to use, is actually global Jews. We are the Jews living all over the world. The problem is that when you say global Jews, it sounds a little bit like globalist. And globalist has become one of those pejoratives that is sometimes a stand-in for Jews and not in a good way. And some might even make a distinction between Jews and Israelis. That is, the Judean lifestyle, the Jewish religious lifestyle, evolved outside of the land of Israel for the most part, even if it looked back there. But the kind of new Jewish identity of a modern Jewish state over the last 70 plus years, that's something different in Jewish life. And the nationalism and the militarism and all of that seems foreign to that long Jewish experience. And so maybe you make a distinction. Well, 20 years ago, a movie came out directed by Steven Spielberg called Munich, which was about the aftermath of the terrorist attacks during the Munich Olympics and the desire for revenge against those terrorists enacted by the Israeli Mossad, a secret service. And one of the scenes in that movie contrasts the Jewishness or the Israeliness of this mission and what it did to the people who were doing it. After all, it's complex to have a national identity, to have political sovereignty, even to have political and military control over people who are not Jewish. We don't have a long precedent for that in Jewish history over the last 2,000 plus years. Now, the word Zionism, which often refers to this attachment to the land of Israel or the desire to live there, is a litmus test today, both within and beyond the Jewish community. You might hear a sentence something like this said very quickly. Do you love Israel? Because if you don't love Israel, you must hate Israel. It's very much seen as a binary, one or the other. I was chatting with someone before the service, and I thought of the phrase trauma terror that people have. They've been traumatized, certainly after October 7th, and they're worried about just about everything. And after all, as they say, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not after you. So maybe it makes sense to be a little nervous about a lot of things. For some people, calling someone a Zionist is a slur. For other people, being called a Zionist or calling oneself a Zionist is a sign of pride. Just like there are different definitions for patriotism, from the MAGA America Firstism to Bill of Rights opposition, valuing international alliances, those are both varieties of patriotism. There's a spectrum of what Zionism could mean. Not all Zionists want to expel Palestinians from Gaza or even from the West Bank, though some Zionists do. Not all anti-Zionists support terrorism as anti-colonial liberation, though some anti-Zionists do. Consider your answers to these questions. Are you a Zionist? And if not, did you used to be a Zionist? And what changed? Maybe it was the collapse of the peace process after the Second Intifada in the early 2000s. Maybe it was Israel's right-wing turn and Netanyahu's ongoing corruption and attacks at the liberal democratic systems in Israel, plus cozying up to right-wing European governments is problematic. Maybe it's the ongoing problems in the West Bank and inequities between Jews and Arabs in East Jerusalem and in Israel proper, the 1949 borders, and even with Israeli Arab citizens. Maybe it's a growing doubt you might have about compatibility of an ethnic state with democratic values. Maybe there's a contradiction there. Now, what makes predicting the future of Zionism so complicated is that there are plenty of self-defined Zionists who cherish the label who are also upset about all of those issues, and yet they're still Zionists. Zionism in all of its varieties was not created and then reacted to in one day or even in 6 days with a day of rest at the end. Zionism and its opposition evolved over time with common features and new twists. Now, the idea of Zionism begins with a place. It's called Mount Zion, Har Zion. It's one of the hills in Jerusalem. And Zionism would have never existed if the Judeans had just stayed in Judea. It started when they left or were expelled initially. In later generations, they might have chosen to leave, but they looked back at that mountain and said, that's my point of origin. Jerusalem was destroyed and the Judeans were taken into exile around 500 BCE. They wanted to return, and many of them did return, but some of them stayed in Babylonia, creating the first diaspora. After the second destruction of Jerusalem around 2,000 years ago, and an even wider diaspora, we stopped calling them Judeans, and we started calling them Jews. Now, some progressive Jews have tried to claim that the real Judaism is this diaspora experience because of all those intervening centuries, and the origin point in Israel is irrelevant. But you have to still explain the last page of the Passover Haggadah. What's one of the last things you say in that Passover Haggadah? Next year in Jerusalem. Not in Warsaw, not in New York, next year in Jerusalem. It's throughout the prayer book, throughout the traditional canon, longing for return, prayers for return. Now, those prayers for return were often articulated with the goal of creating a messianic state with divine endorsement and a rebuilt temple with a newly established priesthood, and even returning to animal sacrifice, which we might not be so hot about. But there's a reason why the ultra-Orthodox in their day and in our own day are still opposed to secular Zionism. You don't vote for the rabbis. You don't vote for what the laws should be. The law was given by God on Mount Sinai. And so a secular Israeli state is anathema, and so some of the anti-Zionists out there are the ultra-Orthodox. We don't picture that. If you picture an anti-Zionist, you picture someone on a college campus, on a street protest, but the ultra-Orthodox are also anti-Zionists in their own way. Now, some other factors that created modern Zionism in the 19th and 20th centuries, and I'm still getting used to saying last century when Zionism started because, well, it was last century. The first was the rise of modern anti-Semitism. This anti-Semitism that treated the Jews like a race, something they could not leave behind or convert away from. It was a betrayal of the emancipation promise, the Enlightenment promise that you could become a German citizen of the Mosaic faith, an American of the Jewish religion alone. If Jews were considered a race and considered foreign despite citizenship, despite their acculturation to the surrounding language and cultural patterns, well, maybe the solution to Jewish exclusion is to say, you don't want me? Well, I leave. I'm going to create a place where I'm the majority, and I'm in charge, and you have to apply to me for immigration permission. Well, that was a reaction to exclusion, was to say, you don't want me, I'm leaving. A second factor in the rise of Zionism, in the late 19th century in particular, was a rise of ethnic nationalism in Central and Eastern Europe. You have to remember, most Jews in Europe were living under the Austro-Hungarian Empire or the Russian Empire. And these were multi-ethnic empires that had Poles and Ukrainians and Serbians and Croats and Albanians, and they gave them varying degrees of autonomy to use their own language and culture, but it was very limited. We forget the first shot fired that set off the conflagration of World War I was fired by a Serbian nationalist who killed the Archduke Francis Ferdinand in Sarajevo. But he was agitating for Serbian ethnic national independence, that the Serbians should have a state for Serbians, with a Serbian flag and the Serbian language and Serbian music and Serbian holidays. Sound familiar? Well, that was the world in which the Zionist idea of ethnic self-determination to the point of a state really took root. Now, some people in this era were satisfied with what they called cultural autonomy under the multi-ethnic empire. So there were people who were interested in Yiddish as a Jewish national language. And if they could get Yiddish language newspapers and Yiddish language schools and Yiddish recognized by the government in official documents, that would have been enough. They didn't need their own territorial governance or an independent state if they had cultural autonomy to live their national ethnic culture. But others insisted that the only way to have full rights as a nation was to have your own state, because then you could make all the decisions yourself. There was also the debate about what do you do with the minorities that live. After all, people have moved. You know, Jews aren't living only in Jewland, and the Ukrainians aren't only living in Ukraine, they're scattered. And what do you do when they live somewhere else? We saw this to terrible effect during the breakup of Yugoslavia in the 1990s, where all these different ethnic groups decided they hated each other after having lived together and mixed together for many decades. The other question was, where do we do this? The Bund and Jewish socialists said, let's do it here. Let's do it in Yiddish. They had this ideology they called Doigkeit, do it here. Let's create a socialist paradise here. But the Zionists said, it's never going to work here. We need our own territory, and where else can we go but Zion, but Zion? We can still be socialists. Let's make kibbutzim. Let's have an egalitarian society with national health care. But we have to do it there, not here. So here or there, Hebrew or Yiddish, these were major debates in the Jewish nationalist world. They agreed the Jews were a people that could live their own culture, but could they do it in the galut, in the diaspora, or did they need to be back in their ancestral homeland? In fact, we've even seen today a rebirth of an ideology that calls itself diasporism, as a contrast to Zionism among some of the Zionist skeptical. They're not necessarily anti-Israel, but they don't want Israel to be the center of their identity. Another factor that led to the rise of Zionism was Jewish secularization. Jews were simply less religious than they used to be, and they wanted a new basis for being Jewish that wasn't simply the old tradition, the old rituals, the old prayers. Now, some decided to go the other way and make it just religion and de-emphasize ethnicity. There was actually an anti-Zionist reform organization called the American Council for Judaism. A version of it still exists today, by the way, but they were lobbying to not support the creation of a Jewish state in Israel. The Balfour Declaration issued by the British government was opposed by British Jews who worried that they would be accused of dual loyalty. How can you be loyal to your own country if you still support the creation of a Jewish country? So another group of anti-Zionists were not just the Jewish socialists, not just the ultra-Orthodox, but even Reform Jews had questions about this Jewish ethno-state. But of course, the tipping point for the Zionist movement and for the actual establishment of the State of Israel was the destruction of the Holocaust before the state was founded, and the repression of the Jews of Arab lands after the state was founded that caused millions of them to move from Iraq and Yemen in the 40s, and Egypt and Libya in the 50s, and Morocco and Tunisia and Algeria in the 60s, and Iran in the 70s. They fled these other countries because of the oppression that they experienced there, and they needed a haven. Just as the survivors of the Holocaust could not go back to Poland. Some of them who went back to Poland were actually killed in Poland by the Poles, who said, "What are you doing back here? You're ghosts." And so they left again, and they found a home ultimately in this land of Israel. Now, Zionism had two goals. One was physical and one was, we might call, spiritual or emotional. The physical goal was simple: Jewish survival. Israel could be a refuge from persecution. It would have the value of Jewish self-defense, of fighting back, and not simply negotiating and trying to survive on the margins. It also had the response of self-separation from the other people. After all, if you want Jews to survive, it helps if they marry other Jews. And if the only options are other Jews, then you do the math. This explains the high support for the State of Israel among American Jews in the years after World War II. American Zionism was the dominant approach. 80, 90% of American Jews, maybe even 95% in some areas, would have identified as Zionists in the 1940s and the 1950s. That American Council for Judaism almost collapsed. The Reform movement also modified its ideology when it came to Zionism. Even some ultra-Orthodox Jews wound up in Israel after surviving the Holocaust. So when we were more precarious as a more recent immigrant community with a stronger anti-Semitic surrounding, maybe that's why American Jews were more Zionist. And perhaps the decline in the American Jewish Zionist consensus is related to our increasing sense of rootedness in America. We're many generations removed. My grandparents on my mother's side were born here. My great-grandparents on my mother's side were the immigrants. And so for many American Jews, immigration is part of the ancient history, not the recent history of memory. And so their sense of precariousness perhaps is not there, and the sense of a need of a haven, of survival for Israel is also not there. This might also explain, by the way, why post-Soviet Jews or Iranian Jews in Los Angeles are much more Zionist, because they've had that more recent experience of expulsion, immigration, precariousness, and perhaps the need for a haven. Now, it was hoped that a Jewish state would be the cure for anti-Semitism. That prediction did not come true. That was the physical goal, Jewish survival. But there was also that emotional goal for Jewish thriving. The Zionists imagined they could spark the creation of a new Jew who would be physically strong from that work in the fields and from fighting back, who would be economically creative and not stuck in the old ways of living in the margins between other societies, who would be intellectually free and creative to make new songs or to take the old and adapt them in new ways. The old Jew was old and bent and studying documents and weak and wearing glasses, while the new Jew stood straight and proud and fought back. That would be a cultural renaissance as well as a physical one. The new Jew and this new Jewish society would create the dignity and the strength of self-determination. It would even help diaspora Jews by the Jewish example in this new land of a Jewish majority. They would speak a Jewish language of Hebrew. They would run the calendar by the Jewish calendar. No more debates about what to do when Passover shows up during the school year. We write the school calendar, and the other holidays have to accommodate to us. There's a sense of dignity in that, right? The sense that we're in charge and we get to run things the way that works for us. And the dignity of fighting back is something incalculable. The first time I went to Israel in the mid-1990s, I was shocked that there were all these T-shirts in all the T-shirt stores for the Israeli Defense Forces. And I thought, why would tourists buy T-shirts for the Israeli, like if I went to France, I'm not going to buy a French Defense Forces T-shirt. But I realized this is vicarious ego strengthening. This is not they fight back, it's we fight back. We are strong. One of the most popular of those T-shirts says, "Don't worry, America, Israel is behind you." It's the claim of we are strong. Am Yisrael Chai, the Jewish people, lives and thrives. One of the other emotional goals of Zionism was a sense of rootedness. There was a proposal early on in the movement to perhaps take British East Africa and make that a haven for the Jews. It might have been a haven for the Jews, but it wasn't Zion. It wasn't the land of Israeli roots. There's a reason why you plant trees in Israel. It's putting roots down. That was the insistence on going back to that land, on walking that land, on planting that land, on doing archaeology in that land to confirm your people's roots. One of the amazing sights you can see is you go to visit literally it's called the Temple of the Book, the Shrine of the Book, dedicated to the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were discovered in the Judean desert dating back to the 1st century BCE, so well over 2,000 years ago. And a reader of modern Hebrew can still read that writing in that language from two scrolls written 2,000 years ago. That's a claim saying we were here and we are here now. There was even a goal that a Jewish state in Israel would provide a normalization to the Jews. We would have Jewish criminals. We would have Jewish beggars and Jewish people on welfare and Jewish people who were marginalized. But that's okay. Even Jewish prostitutes, said David Ben-Gurion, that would be progress because we'd be like everybody else. And wouldn't it be nice for once to not be a nation set apart, a nation different from everybody else? We're going to be like everybody else, even with the problems. And we no longer be a ghost nation that lost its body and was floating around like a specter through Europe and Middle East. We would have a body, a place to reside. And finally, the hope was that this Jewish state with a Jewish language and Jewish people and Jewish history and rootedness would create a new Jewish culture. We would be a light unto the Jews living among all those nations. They would sing our music. They would dance our folk dancing. Do you remember 30, 40 years ago how big Israeli folk dancing was? It was such a big activity in Jewish community centers and schools and so on. There's something odd about it because the folk dancing is supposed to be what the peasants did hundreds of years ago. But hundreds of years ago, we weren't in that land and we weren't farmers. We were urban traders and craftsmen, and that was our job. We weren't doing folk dances back then, and we certainly weren't doing co-ed folk dances in shorts back then. But this is that sense of rootedness, that sense of cultural creativity, that you can make your own folk dances from scratch if need be. So these were the goals of Zionism. These are what all the varieties of Zionism share, this cultural creativity, but also the sense of rootedness and strength and power and self-esteem and dignity that comes from having your own territory as a group. Well, the problem was that there were many ways to get there. So there were the political Zionists who wanted an international mandate like the Balfour Declaration to help create the state on a legal international basis, culminating in the United Nations Declaration of the right of the Jews to have a state in 1947. There was the labor Zionist movement I alluded to before that was focused on the kibbutz and agricultural settlement, but also Jewish labor unions and socialist action in creating a socialist and largely secular society. Sadly, today there's sort of a shadow of that Jewish socialism left because the Labor Party has mostly collapsed and the remaining kibbutzim are relatively small compared to what they used to be. But most of all, the Labor Party and the left in Israel was so attached to the Oslo peace process that when that peace process collapsed, when withdrawal was met with rocket fire and other problems, that ultimately they failed. And the other problem was that their opponents, the settlers who wanted to build and increase the hold of the Jews in the West Bank, won because they just kept building, and the left wasn't able to stop them. Now, we also had the revisionist Zionist Party, which was more pro-capitalist, less socialist. It was a maximalist for Jewish territory and for fighting back. This is the ancestor of the Likud Party today. But the Likud Party today was historically secular, not in bed with the religious right or the ultra-Orthodox, and the historic Likud was also pro-democracy. In fact, Benny Begin, who was the son of Menachem Begin, the chief leader of the Likud Party for many decades, Benny Begin hates Netanyahu, has rejected what Netanyahu has to stand for. Because nowadays the Likud is mostly about Netanyahu and not about the Likud ideology. In fact, many of the more committed Likud ideologues have left the Likud Party and formed other parties. If you added up all the former Likudniks, you would have a mega party in Israel, but they can't stand Netanyahu. Now, we do have religious Zionists too, of course. These were people who didn't like the idea of making a secular state, but they figured we could use the secular Jews building the state to ultimately bring the Messiah, to ultimately lead to that redemption we had hoped for centuries. And so they maintained what we would call a modern Orthodox lifestyle. They always served in the army, for example, but they figured the secular Zionists were part of the divine plan. Now, this movement transformed after 1967. With the Six-Day War and the conquest of Gaza and the West Bank, they saw an opportunity and even a divine hand in that victory. They were emboldened to claim, we are the masters of the land, and we can take by any right and by any means what we claim is our birthright. In fact, they call themselves mitnachalim, which means the inheritors, that this is our rightful patrimony we are claiming. They don't call it the West Bank or the occupied territories. They call it Yehudah and Shomron, Judah and Samaria. We're back to the Judeans again. They want to reclaim the Judeanness by reclaiming the land that formerly was Judah. These are Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, you might read about in the paper. These are the religious settlers. You might even call some of them, the ones on the extreme right end, a kind of racist Zionism, because they make no bones about wanting to expel Israeli Arabs, but also Palestinians from the West Bank and even from Gaza. We've heard that recently too. And they claim their right as the masters of the land to be sovereign, to do what they will. They are the vigilantes that attack Palestinian villages at night, even beating up the Oscar-winning director of a documentary film just this last week. So these are also Zionists, just as the left-wing Labor Zionist Party are Zionists. And then there are diaspora Zionists, people who have no intention of moving to Israel. They may have family there. They may actually be Israelis who left Israel and moved here, but still look back fondly, or have family still living there. They see their mission as not to move to Israel, but to help to build and support a Jewish state, no matter where they are. Their Israeli connection, their Zionism, is a part of their diaspora Jewish identity, even if they have no plane tickets and no hotel or apartment reservations. They have no plans to move there as part of their Jewishness, but supporting Israel is part of their Jewishness. That's why they plant trees on Tu B'Shvat, not here, but there, to demonstrate their rootedness. And this is why there still exists, as I mentioned, a World Zionist Congress. In fact, the World Zionist Congress is having its election right now. It is, I think, 24 different slates are running for the seats for the American Jewish community. All you have to do is identify as Jewish and be over 18 and willing to give the World Zionist Congress $5 with a credit card. I don't know why they're still asking for $5, but it goes back to this idea that you have to contribute your shekel to be a part of the group. Okay. But once you've done your $5, you can vote for a slate from the far left slate of Hatikva, which I actually happen to be listed on. I think I'm number 32 on the list of people on the slate, and last time they got 10 people, so I'm very unlikely to get elected. But I am on that slate because their platform represents my kind of Zionism. But there are people to the right of me, and then to the far right of me, and then there's even an ultra-Orthodox slate that the ultra-Orthodox rabbis have said, don't vote for it because you're supporting Zionism, which you're not supposed to do. But why would they run? Because the World Zionist Congress gets to determine the allocation of up to $5 billion of money over the next 5 years, both in global Jewry and in Israel proper. And so one of the reasons why I've been running on this Hatikva slate and encouraging people to vote that way if they are so moved and agree with the platform is that if you don't, other people will vote for funding the settlements and funding educational programs that promote a religious and Orthodox Jewish life instead of the pluralistic LGBTQ affirmative Jewish identity that most American Jews actually follow. It's still there, that diaspora Zionism, it still exists, and it still has an impact even in the state of Israel. Zionism faces a lot of challenges today. It has the challenge of the collective versus the individual. Does a collective have rights? Does a group have rights? Does a group have obligations that they can force you to fulfill? Should citizenship be defined by your group identity and not just by your individual identity? Well, are you a member of the tribe to become part of the society, or is this an Enlightenment idea of universalism and an anti-tribalism? Which is it? Are we anti-tribalism or are we members of the tribe? And of course, that question of universalism versus tribalism impacts our empathy. It impacts our empathy for collateral damage and for casualties of the other. What is our calculus of how many civilian casualties is worth it for a high-value target? But that also can include a universalist non-empathy for Israelis. After all, if you're a pure universalist and Israel represents the oppression of a minority and by any means necessary is justified, then the death of Israelis is the cost of liberation. Too bad, so sad. We wonder also, what is the impact of conversion to Judaism? A recent study showed that something like 14% of American Jews who self-define by religion were not raised Jewish. They converted or became Jewish at some point in their life. Does someone who becomes Jewish come with a more universal approach because of their roots and are more empathetic to the outsiders? Or are they more particular because they've chosen this identity and now they've dived in the deep end? And you can also ask what impact the phenomenon of intermarriage has had. Because there's an increasing number of American Jews, and particularly liberal American Jews, have a non-Jewish partner and non-Jewish in-laws and family, and non-Jewish family ties and empathy beyond Jewish ethnic identity. Well, they're not just asking, is it good for the Jews when something happens? They're asking, is it good for my family? Is it good for anybody? And so they may have a differing response to the inside-outside balance. A second challenge that Zionism faces today is we just don't have a lot of experience as Jews exercising government, military power, the rule of law. We're not even that familiar with democracy. I mean, we thought America was familiar with democracy, and look how that's going. Well, Israel has even less familiarity, and they're having as many problems. What does the Jewish mean in a Jewish state? Is it ethnic demography? Or is it the religious character? Or is it having a privileged population and minorities that simply have to suck it up? You know, in France, they don't necessarily care as much if you speak another language. We do French here. In Canada, they try and balance the French and the English, although the French are perennially complaining about the English. In Israel, the national anthem is in Hebrew. There's no Arabic verses. The national flag is a Jewish star, and the assumption is that 20% just have to suck it up. They're in a Jewish state, we set the tone, we set the culture. But is that comfortable for us living in America, which in theory, is a non-ethnic democracy? Israel and Zionism face the challenge of paradoxical commitments. Zionism wanted a Jewish state, and the early Zionists were explicit. They wanted a democratic state. It doesn't use the word democracy in the Declaration of Independence, but it is in their basic laws they passed in 1985 and 1992. They very clearly said, we are a democratic state and a Jewish state, both. But the argument today is over which is more important, a Jewish state or a state of all its citizens. If you want a Jewish state, then you're going to minimize the democratic rights of the non-Jewish population. You're going to enforce Jewish supremacy, you might even say. But if you emphasize the state of all of its citizens, then you have to minimize the Jewish character of the state, or at least find accommodations to those who don't fit in the dominant population's identity. Jews have a right of return. There's even this birthright trip you might have heard of, right? You get to go on a birthright, because it's your birthright trip to visit this homeland of yours. But for Palestinians, some of whom were born in this territory, they don't have the right of return. So this is an imbalance. The question is that the necessary compromise of a Jewish and democratic state, or is this tipping it too far to one side or the other? Of course, Zionism's major claim, and it's playing out on the streets of protest and college campuses and online to the nth degree, it's the competing claims for the same territory with the Palestinians. One of the early slogans of Zionism that was another big mistake was a people without land for a land without people. There's no real people there, so we don't have to worry about it. Well, unfortunately, there were people there. If Israel demands more territory, or wants to control more territory, or wants to have go or no-go vetoes over more territory, is that for security reasons, or is it because they're claiming the land of the Bible? After all, those religious settlers, their deed is the book of Genesis. That's their claim to that land. Arab citizens in Israel today are still 20% of the population, and the Jewish population is about 80%. But if the West Bank were fully integrated into Israel and the Palestinians living there were given the vote in an Israeli state as equal citizens, then it would be 60% Jewish and 40% Arab, maybe 55 and 45. And if they included Gaza in that as well, it would be more like 50-50. And it's really hard to have a democratic and Jewish state when you allow everyone to vote and the Knesset, the parliament, is 50% Arab parties. They're not going to be in favor of all these things that have been happening, the inequitable distribution of money and resources. On the other hand, if you have a state that is 60-40 even, and you don't allow a good chunk of that 40 to vote, as is the case now, then you're losing something on the democratic side. You're controlling a people that don't get to vote for their own future. So you're stuck in this paradox between the two. Unless maybe those problematic people would just go away somewhere. Maybe some other country like Egypt or Jordan would take them. I saw a news item just today that Israel has been talking to some African countries about possibly taking some of the Palestinians from Gaza. And if they would just, disappear, go away somewhere, then we'd have plenty of room. We'd have a wonderful demographic balance. Everything would be just fine. Now, this idea of expulsion goes back to Meir Kahane. You may remember him in the Jewish Defense League in the 1980s. He formed a party in the Knesset called the Kach Party, which was explicitly in favor of expelling thousands of Palestinians from the West Bank and claiming it as fully Israeli territory. His party was expelled from the Knesset as too racist, as inciting to violence. The descendants of Meir Kahane are in charge of the police force in Israel under Itamar Ben-Gvir. Now, there's another possible solution to preserve the Jewish and democratic and the demographic numbers. It's called the two-state solution, where most Palestinians will live in a Palestinian state, and most, if not all, Israelis will live in an Israel, and they have a demographic separation, and they can each have their majorities and each run their own affairs and each have their own national self-determination. That was the idea. But these days, it seems almost impossible to separate the two. They've mixed. The settler population continues to grow, and they show no signs of wanting to leave. So maybe another idea that's been proposed, another solution, is a binational confederation. Think about Canada with the French and the Anglos. Think about Belgium with the Flemish and the Walloons. Think about Switzerland with the different groups and languages there. They can find a way to each have their national language and culture, but have some shared economy and some shared governance. Does it sound pie in the sky? Yes. Are all the other answers pie in the sky? Yes. There are no good answers to this dilemma. But this is the paradoxical challenge that Zionism finds itself in. And finally, we have this latest challenge you heard on college campuses, that Israel is colonialism. It's just European colonialism continued. It's like India, it's like North Africa with the French, it's more of the same. Well, the problem is, as I've already mentioned, a large chunk of the Israeli Jewish population came from the Middle East. They didn't come from Europe. They actually look more Arab than European, if you want to be crudely racist about it. And of course, the Ethiopian Jews look like they're from Ethiopia, because they are. You see, the Jews living in Israel are in a homeland. They are not the colonists like the French in Algeria, who came in the 1830s and left in the 1960s, 50s. When people say on the college campuses, go back to Europe, first of all, it begs the question, why did they leave Europe again? I think I remember. It wasn't that long ago. But also, many of them didn't come from Europe. And they can't go back to Iraq. They can't go back to Morocco and Algeria. And so this is the dilemma, that Israel is not a colonial power like other colonial powers. And yet, what happens in the West Bank with unequal access roads and differing systems of laws and unequal treatment. Just this last week, the director of that documentary beaten up by settlers and then arrested by soldiers who came to break up the fight. It's not equal. It's not fair, and it's almost colonial in its separation of unequal treatment and lack of rights. Now, are these challenges insurmountable? Is Zionism itself, no matter its form, inherently unethical and chauvinist and destructive? Well, those who answer yes would call themselves anti-Zionists, and that includes some Jews. 25 years ago, there was a baby board book series that started. I remember using them with my kids. It was called, "That's Not My Puppy. That's Not My Elephant. That's Not My Giraffe." And the idea of the board books was you could feel, that's not my giraffe, its skin is too shiny. That's not my giraffe, its legs are too long. That's not my giraffe, its tail is too bushy, and it had different textures in the book. Well, what I feel like when people argue about Zionism is I keep wanting to say, well, that's not my Zionism. The Zionism you don't like, I don't like that Zionism either. But the question becomes, are we stuck with the worst version of this identity? And if you highlight a version of Zionism that's different from the one you don't like, is there enough core features in common for any kind of common identity? You know, my Zionism may not be yours. I value both collective national ethnic rights and individual rights. I understand the challenges of defining Jewish in a Jewish state, which I see more as demographic and cultural than religious or authoritative or exclusionary. I am committed to both a Jewish and democratic state, that both values are important to me, and I appreciate the competing for this common land with other peoples that also have a right to national self-determination and living in security and dignity. I can live in the power of paradox. Maybe it comes from my job. I'm a humanist and a rabbi at the same time. And for some people that doesn't make any sense, but for me, it resonates because it's who I am. The reason why the Hatikva slate calls itself Hatikva, it's from the national anthem. It means the hope. We still have hope that there can be an Israel that matches that vision. Some will disagree, and I don't disagree with their right to disagree. I hope, though, that enough people who see that vision can make it happen. The protests on the streets of Israel this week and in previous weeks over the last 2+ years have often used the Israeli flag as their symbol, saying this is our Israel, the scroll of the Independence Declaration as their values, and the words of the national anthem as their vision. We sang it tonight, Lihyot am chofshi ba'artzenu, to be a free people in our land. It can still happen, but it only happens if people make it real. That's why Herzl said, if you will it, it is not a dream, but if you don't act, it never happens.